How about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. My voice is sissy soft. I'm so excited to be here for the first time ever at Duke. No, not. And especially with scholars whose work really I couldn't imagine living or thinking without them. I want to dive in with an epigraph from Holland's Erotic Life of Racism. Quote, "One way to begin this work is to rethink the place of reproduction, not as hetero or homo, not as a feminist or a women's, and its attention to biology, race, and belonging," end quote. The last time I taught Marlon Riggs' classic 1989 film, Tongues Untied, actually, could I have that?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. Last time I taught this film, I was struck by the pastiche of the parting scene, a melange of newsreel scenes from the 1965 Selma to Montgomery civil rights marchers fades into a contingent of black men marching down Christopher Street in New York's Gay Pride Parade. A series of still portraits is superimposed onto the civil rights marchers: Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. And could we have the...
I listen for my own quiet implosion. But while I wait, older, stronger rhythms resonate within me, sustain my spirit, silence the clock.
Turn me around, keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up the freedom. Turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, homophobia. Turn me around, keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up the freedom. Turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, there's no way. Turn me around, keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up the freedom way. Turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up the freedom.
Whatever awaits me, this much I know. I was blind to my brother's beauty, and now I see my own. Deaf to the voice that believed we were worth wanting, loving each other. Now I hear. I was mute, tongue-tied, burdened by shadows and silence. Now I speak, and my burden is lightened, lifted, free.
The visual assumptions of this temporal collage are so familiar that I never paused to ponder the logic holding together its moving parts into a singular visual gesture. On the one hand, Riggs connects the Gay Pride Parade to the Civil Rights Movement that occurred some 2.5 decades earlier, as though they constitute a single diachronic narrative, the earlier march bleeding into the Pride Parade, as if the march paves the way for the parade. On the other hand, at the same time, the two disparate events are also made synchronous, as though the march and parade are occurring perpetually, coterminously, in the same horizon of history. The 19th century portraits add a third temporal dimension to the scene. We understand instinctively the relation of the three abolitionists to the Civil Rights March. After all, the political vocabulary of emancipating citizenship remains consistent from the 1860s to the 1960s. But what exactly is the relation of the abolitionist precursors to the Pride Parade? Do Tubman, Douglass, and Truth foreparent the Pride Parade in the same way that they are assumed to do for the march? The abolitionists were committed suffragists, a fact that might lend some credence to their linkage with queer rights. But would the abolitionists recognize, much more condone and endorse, equal rights based on sexual orientation, a concept formulated after they had long left this earth, and a fourth dimension to the moving collage, and one that the filmmaker slips in even more slyly. Riggs blends another still portrait into the sequence of ancestral guardians. Superimposed over Martin Luther King Jr.'s face is a portrait of Bayard Rustin. Rustin serves to suture the gap between the 19th century abolitionists and the 1960s marchers, and more pointedly between the civil rights movement and the Gay Pride Parade. The inclusion of Rustin alongside the 19th century abolitionists, however, might be considered another trompe l'oeil, elevating the lesser-known civil rights activist to the status of historical giant. Like another homosexual who has been anointed a token black saint of GLBTQ rights, James Baldwin, Rustin's identification with the cause was less than fulsome. For like Baldwin, he prioritized the struggle for racial equality over the one for queer rights, and held a notion of sexuality as a private matter inconsistent with the queer liberation movement. John D'Amelio quotes Rustin in the final year of Rustin's life, responding to Jobim's request for a contribution to the groundbreaking Black Gay volume in the Life. After much thought, Rustin wrote, I have decided that I must decline. I did not come out of the closet voluntarily. Circumstances forced me out. While I support fully equality under the law for homosexuals, I fundamentally consider sexual orientation to be a private matter. As such, it has not been a factor which has greatly influenced my role as an activist. By declining to be included in the formative text of Black gay male identity formation in 1986, Rustin refused the very role that Riggs foists on him 3 years later in a film that emerges directly from the anthology from which Rustin had excluded himself as an unworthy participant. Rustin's hesitance to claim a cause so closely and publicly aligned with his homosexual identity might give us pause in any rush to enlist those more temporally and culturally distant abolitionists as ancestral guardians to queer rights. If the Black race is blood kin, then exclusion and estrangement from that natural family become all the more difficult to justify and enact, at least theoretically. For the blood of Tubman, Douglas, and Truth courses through the veins of contemporary Black queers, just as it flows through that of the civil rights marchers, or so the logic goes. Riggs introduces the closing pastiche with this concept of the bloodline when he says, still I listen to the beat of my heart. Let this primal pulse lead me, though lately I've lived with another rhythm. At first I thought just time passing, but I discovered a time bomb ticking in my blood. I wait for my own quiet implosion. But while I wait, older, stronger rhythms resonate within me, sustain my spirit, silence the clock. When Riggs utters the phrase, older, stronger rhythms, we are confronted with a spectral image of his face, the final face in a series of obituary portraits of Black men who have died from AIDS. And then his haunting face bleeds into that of Harriet Tubman's. The older, stronger rhythms of the abolitionist ancestors not only guard over queer rights, the pulse of their ancestral blood also silences the ticking time bomb of HIV. Just as the civil rights ancestors legitimate the Gay Pride Parade at the grand scale of historical time, so at the minute scale of anatomical time, the beat of their bloodline symbolically cleanses the HIV, ominously pulsing in his veins. This section is called Theories Trouble with Analogy. As common as the kind of analogizing made visual in Tongues Untied is, the family romance of the marriageability of sexual orientation to race cannot allay the suspicions and caveats that both race theorists and activists and queer theorists and activists have forcefully issued against such analogous thinking when it comes to identity formations. For Robin Whitman, for instance, analogy is the genie who casts a spell unleashing modern identity formation. Through the crafting of analogic relations, she writes, the deployment of race was multiplied, radiating outward to constitute new identities of bodies as sexual, gendered, and criminal excesses. end quote. Analogy is the bugbear to be wrestled and defeated. That it is a bad idea simply to compare identities or the oppressions produced through them has become a commonplace of race, gender, and queer theory, even as we compulsively engage in such analogizing in the very text declaiming analogies' theoretical deficiencies. Kimberly Crenshaw and her critical legal colleagues composed theories of intersectionality partly to overcome the weaknesses and gaps created by the drive to analogize as the prevailing paradigm of identity instruction and legal remedy. More recent theorists developing a queer color critique, like Rod Ferguson, as well as myself, have likewise warned against analogy as a falsification of the multifaceted crisscrossings already imbricated within any claim to identity. In her recent book, Beautiful Bottom, Beautiful Shame, Catherine Bond Stockton provides an exemplary instance of the theoretical sophistication required to think a relation between queerness and blackness without falling back on simple analogizing. She points out that, quote, the possible mismatch between race and sexual orientation in the eyes of critical legal theorists does not stop blacks and gays from being flashed as signs of each other by liberals and conservatives, end quote. Stockton more forthrightly acknowledges what we usually pretend to be able to overcome, the need to analogize when speaking of identity, even as she devises theories to compensate for analogy's deep discontents. Rather than suspicion or critique, like Stockton, I want to honor the seemingly irrepressible impulse toward analogizing in the hope that we can better grasp the logistics of similitude, not only in everyday political rhetoric, but also in academic theory. Acknowledging the crudeness of analogy as a tool of analysis, I want to see whether we can harness that clumsiness towards some clarity about the everyday experience of racism and homophobia as double agents spying the borders between race and sexuality. In her recent Erotic Life of Racism, Sharon Holland argues that, quote, race coheres in the everyday practice of familial belonging. Holland's theory compels us back not just to the familial body, the bloodline, but also to the bodily desire as racism's always queer libido, its lifeblood. Racism can also be described as the emotional lifeblood of race, she writes. It is the feeling that articulates and keeps the flawed logic of race in its place. While lamenting what she calls bad analogy, implicitly, Holland compels us to rethink our unavoidable habit of analogy as a tangible, fleshly, everyday practice that binds race and sexuality, blood and lust, and what James Baldwin calls the thrust and counter-thrust, locking black and white together in a cage of reality. Following Holland, we can begin to understand not only how the bloodline of racial identification hells the lustfulness of sexual identity, but also how the lifeblood of sexual categorization compels the lustfulness of racial thresholds. Given the crudeness of analogy, it may be helpful to at least polish its drive toward brutal similitude by stipulating a couple of distinctions. Keeping with the paradigm of bloodline and lifeblood, blood and lust, I want to highlight the importance of analogous thinking in the biological sciences, harkening back to Wigman's comparative anatomy as a springboard of modern identity. In biology, analogy indicates functional similarity between anatomical parts without similarity of structure and origin. In other words, biological analogy is like metaphor, an observed sameness across a more fundamental difference. When GLBTQ activists argued that eliminating the federal ban against same-gender marriage fulfills the promise established by the Supreme Court striking down of state anti-miscegenation law in the 1967 Loving versus Virginia decision, they are using analogy in this basic sense. As we shall see in a moment, one cannot construct any group, say the Negro, as an object of empirical observation, as a social problem, as a legal entity, without analogizing toward other groups. We fancifully theorize this as a Hegelian dialectic. when we might be more forthright just to say that it's a simple analogy, and one whose intellectual crudeness bespeaks the onerous brutalities to actual persons that occasion the erection and maintenance of such an analogy. The analogizing we saw at work in Rieg's closure to Tongues Untied, however, goes beyond the picturing of a similarity across the anatomical parts of different organisms. In hailing the abolitionist foreparents, Riggs insists on a similarity more fundamentally based in structure and origin. His comparison is thus not merely analogous, but is more vigorously structured through homology, which in biology indicates likeness in structure between parts of different organisms due to evolutionary differentiation from the same or a corresponding part of a remote ancestor. Whereas analogy might be seen as a sort of bastard form, homology names a real, that is structural and material, sameness deriving from a single chronologically obscured origin. Observing the intellectual work of analogy and homology in the formation of U.S. natural law, we can begin to see how bloodline and lifeblood, racial kinship, and inappropriate libido pulsate within similar, if not the same, ideological arteries and veins. After a foray into the national origins of racist analogizing, we'll return to Rigg's homologous closure of Tongues Untied. This section is called Mr. Jefferson's Bestial Libido. This scene is inspired by a paper Sharon Holland delivered last month at the Hallelujah Love Conference at Princeton, where I had the honor of being a co-speaker in a panel on queering love. Her paper set my mind ablaze with analogous thinking. I started to consider how the beast, as figuring both the lower animals and the in/appropriate desire or lust thrusting up from the nether self, occupies a tertiary position, constructing blackness and queerness through a fraught relation with each other. I immediately thought of Mr. Jefferson's notes on this. At Virginia, we always have to call him Mr. Jefferson. Although I don't think he's going to be happy what I have to say. I immediately thought of Mr. Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia and began to imagine this scene in response to Holland's inquiry. Jefferson's query 14, which focuses on the constitution of laws, is inundated with analogous thinking. At the heart of Jefferson's disquisition is his rationalization and naturalization, not just of race, but more fundamentally of racism, in Holland's theory, the emotional lifeblood of race, as requisite to Republican law, with a small r. As the following passage exposes, race is to bloodline, lineage defined through color hierarchy, as racism is to lifeblood, the improper object of desire, or where the engorged penis should be properly aimed. So every time I say bloodline, think of the engorged penis aiming somewhere. As the following passage, okay.
So do we have to?
Well, some of us might want to and some of us might not. So here's Jefferson, query 14. The first difference which strikes us is that of color. Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the two races? Are not the fine mixtures of red and white, the expressions of every passion by greater or less suffusions of color in the one, preferable to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers all the emotions of the other race? Add to these flowing hair a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of the whites, declared by their preference of them as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for the black woman over those of his own species. Note how in seeking to fix a natural hierarchy of color, Jefferson immediately falls into effluences. The fixity of the color hierarchy paradoxically drives toward the excitability of libido as an economy of right and wrong directions for desire. We must remind ourselves that Jefferson is talking about literal faces. There's something queer here, though, in how, we must remind ourselves that Jefferson is talking about literal faces, the chromatic scale that colors the white face from the blush of lust to the blush of embarrassment. There is something queer here, though, in how the desire-inducing subject, the face of the white female, so strongly resembles the white man's engorging penis, blushing with red with desire and embarrassment. Does the face of the negress and immovable veil of monochrome blackness also resemble the engorging penis of the Negro man? Clearly not, because otherwise Jefferson's argument about desire's natural drive toward white beauty and abrupt halt at the sight of a black woman's face would be upset. Jefferson answers the question definitively when he claims that the Negro naturally lusts for the white woman, not for the negress, just as the orangutan naturally lusts for the negress rather than the female orangutan. Racial bloodline necessitates lifeblood, the proper flow of desire, not just by race, but according to other prospective objects as well. An improper object can be based on race, gender, kin relation, or species. Holland's erotic Life of Racism theorizes blood as a crucial vector of the racial family romance, as a source of misbegotten misrecognition that constantly reproduces efficacious and falsifying histories. Jefferson's analogy allows us to expand the role of bloodline beyond blood to include other effluences that misshape race as the threshold between kin and stranger. Semen, spit, sweat, mucus, tears, piss, shit, vomit, any exchangeable fluid can aid racism's drive to turn lifeblood into bloodlust. We see this racist obsession with exchangeable fluids clearly expressed when Jefferson writes in that same passage in the black ink, and I'm not going to read it because of time, but you can read what he says about other. And there are many passages. In one passage, he talks about the sweat glands and how the smell of the Negro indicates the Negro has to be black naturally because white people don't smell. They also don't labor in the fields in his period, but at least he did. Although other fluids are just as materially relevant, I want to focus here on semen as analogous to blood and sustaining the lifeblood of racist law and practice. Unlike the other exchangeable effluents, semen, of course, has the capacity for reprolineation, reproduction of the bloodline. So it deserves special consideration. This is why, though he never names semen as such, Jefferson trains his analogical eye on the misdirection of sexual desire through his orangutan analogy. If the structure of racism is analogy, the action verb of racism is the direction of lust, here thrusting upward from the male of a lower species to the female of the next higher species. Jefferson would have plenty of opportunity to observe with that handy telescope he always had lying about, Negro men lusting after white women, presumably, so let's just not quibble about that. How Jefferson garners empirical evidence that orangutans lust for Negro women is a valid question. Are there orangutans roaming the wilds of Virginia seeking to rape Negro women? The terms of the analogy are nonetheless curious, if not downright queer. Animal studies scholars like Michael Lundblad have brought attention to the role that the Negro plays in securing the hierarchy between human and animal, but we might also attend to the way in which the likely chance of desire excitedly leaping across species from great ape to Negro, from Negro to white, is foundational to the erection of race as a natural category, justifying its status as Republican law. The affluence of desire is the lifeblood that establishes the bloodline of racial families, thus necessarily pollutes itself as bloodlust, creating the demand for constant policing and punishment by the state. In Jefferson's time, the legal remedy for misdirected desire, whether inappropriately toward a person of another race or toward a person too close in kin, et cetera, the legal remedy for all these lustful aims was incarceration, whipping, or hanging until death. Gonna skip some here. Jefferson's inept analogy clarifies a common misperception about the foundation of American racism. Racism is not just about the establishment of a color hierarchy through the bloodline, one racial lineage above another. For legally, this idea of race is not enforceable. For race to work racially, that is, for it to be enforceable in everyday practice, it must also have a lifeblood that risks bloodlust, a fluid economy of desire that legitimates one libidinal direction as natural, while bastardizing another as naturally unnatural. A law determining which offspring of the same master is free and which captive gives that master the license, indeed encouragement, to produce both legitimate and bastard offspring while disinheriting the latter to protect and grow the inheritance of the former. In Jefferson's analogy, it appears that cross-species desire, what happened? Sorry. In Jefferson's analogy, it appears that cross-species desire can only move upward, at least where the male is concerned. Conveniently, the desire of the female is evacuated from this passage. To ask whether the female also desires upward throws a monkey wrench or orangutan wrench into the whole project. In addition to absenting the question of female desire, upward male desire relieves Jefferson of having to extend the analogy to its logical conclusion. If the male of the species naturally desires upward, then who exactly is the natural object of a white man's desire? If the white man is the top species, then he has to settle for the white woman, who, though not his equal, is his species mate, contradicting the logic of the analogy. Perhaps the white man's desire upward to the angels, whose capacity for sexual division and erotic desire befuddled even the great Milton. This would certainly help to explain why white plantation mistresses are mythologized as purely angelic or seductively devilish in so much of a U.S. discourse from Birth of the Nation to last year's hit race problem movie, The Help. Jefferson's analogy of what upward desire serves to cover up a more pertinent question. What happens when the engorged penis desires downward? In colonial and Republican law, the answer is quite simple. Outlaw all cross-species sexual intercourse, which the colonies did, including criminalizing intercourse across races. When the colony of Virginia established the mother's bloodline as the basis for a free or captive condition of the offspring in 1662, the same law doubled the penalty for acts of miscegenation already established in the colony's legal code. And you can read the law as it's stated there. This law of matrilineal descent for determining the slave condition enables us to ponder the apparent absence of homology in Jefferson's passage. He's rooted in analogy. He doesn't talk about a remote ancestor. Shouldn't we expect the establishment of racial bloodline in law to appeal most aggressively to homology as a way of legitimating one racial family over another? The 1662 law reminds us that even though homology haunts every articulation of the racial analogic, law must explicitly avoid such reasoning. To use a remote ancestor to justify racial difference would be to raise mayhem in regard to the entangled family lines of masters and slaves or slave traders and their kidnapped human booty. The law must spotlight, instead of the remote forefather, the immediately most recent mother, the one whose wounded womb gives incontrovertible evidence of your bloodline, to ensure that slave descent is traceable. Even though the enslaved mother's womb is forced into a redaction of mercantile reproductivity, the captive mother, ironically, is excluded from what Judith Halberstam calls reproductive temporality, or repro time, based in paradigmatic markers of normal respectability geared around marriage, work, child rearing, and longevity. Though turned into an engine of reproductivity, the enslaved mother necessarily occupies Halberstam's queer time, for, as Hortense Spillers has theorized, the slave mother stands outside the law in order to inaugurate it, not only outside the rule of patrilineage, but also outside the protocol of feminine complementarity. Critical race theorists have driven home this idea that rather than diminishing or eliminating racial inequity, US law produces race to abet racism. We have no better instance of this than the Virginia Colony's 1662 statute. Jefferson's white Monticello visitors were quick to note the striking physical resemblance between master and captive. This was an everyday form of analogy, directly countering the laws that Jefferson helped to establish. My students still practice this everyday form of analogizing when they discover that Sally Hemings, the captive woman who bore at least 6 children sired by Jefferson, was in fact the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife, Martha Wells Skelton. When my students realize that Martha and Sally are half-sisters, blood kin, they immediately leap to a clumsy analogy based in phenotype. No wonder Jefferson desired Sally. She must have looked a lot like Martha. This is a roundabout way of saying she had to look white more like Martha than like, well, the Negro woman who is wooed by Jefferson's orangutan. Once Jefferson's desire downward for his Negro slave is exposed by the modern version of natural history, DNA evidence, people do exactly what the 1662 Virginia statute had intended to prevent. They used the bloodline intended to segregate Hemings' condition from Jefferson's inheritance to instead recount the bloodlust binding Jefferson and Hemings' lines. My students' analogizing from Sally's to Martha's phenotype, however, flirts with exchanging the brutality of racism's customary illegal practice of desire with a familiar family romance. How can a great man, alone and lonely, not fall for the half-sister of his long-deceased wife? The brutal analogy that my students should make when discovering the blood relation between Martha and Sally instead should consider Jefferson's phallic move down, across the species line, from Martha, the proper object of white male desire, to Sally, whose veil of blackness should have arrested his desire as bestial and thus forbidden. That Jefferson engages in bestiality, not just miscegenation, when he copulates with Sally is an altogether conveniently forgotten fact today, though the scandalmongers during Jefferson's presidency did not overlook it. This leads me to my final point about Jefferson's orangutan analogy. Once we begin to unravel it, Jefferson's analogy reveals a curious kin relation between queer sexualities and racial designation, operating through law from the colonial moment to the present. If we think through Jefferson's analogy, we begin to realize that really there is no reason why lusting upward or downward must cease at only 1 degree. Once one has desired down, why not go 2 or 3 degrees? Virginia institutes its post-revolutionary sodomy law in 1792, based on the earlier burglary edicts of English ecclesiastical and common law, and the statutory law passed under Elizabeth I, as well as his own colonial code. And this is the 1950 law that is still in effect, even though it was overturned by 2003 Lawrence versus Texas Supreme Court decision. And you can see that that bestiality and sodomy are linked together in that law, as it was for most of the laws in many of the states, especially in the South. Miscegenation, polygamy, sodomy, incest, and zoophilia are analogous crimes in colonial and Republican law, one flowing naturally into the next. If in Jefferson's analogy, miscegenation is the Negro's lusting upward to the white woman, in historical and contemporary everyday political, moral, and religious rhetoric, the sodomite inverts the Negro's lusting upward, for the sodomite is always imaged as lusting atavistically downward toward the animals. This is why the opponents of same-gender marriage reliably turn to a serial analogy of sexual declination that must transpire if lesbians and gays are allowed intergender marriage. From gay marriage to polygamy, to incest, to pedophilia, to bestiality as the clinching climax of atavistic disorder. It thus makes sense that since the Supreme Court overturned sodomy laws in 2003, more than a dozen states have passed a rash of anti-bestiality statutes. People have begun to ask whether there's an epidemic of zoophilia raging across the country. They failed to recognize that often as in the Commonwealth of Virginia Code, sodomy and bestiality are entangled in the same statute. This is my conclusion. Looping back to Riggs' sly homology that it closes tongues and tide, we can now begin to recognize how homology, which might seem to rehearse the bloodlust that binds racial kinship to disciplined sexual desire, instead, or at the same time, contravenes the clumsy analogic foundational to American law and custom. Riggs' appeal to remote ancestors in order to legitimate a queer bloodline resorts to the racial romance of kin family while occupying Halberstam's queer temporality. As it bleeds civil rights into queer rights, the film's closure also splices and fuses time into an eternal protest parade, the beat of the blood into a perpetual sustenance of the spirit by ancestral guardians. When we look again, we see against the respectable posturing dress of the civil rights marchers, a contingent of fleshly black male bodies, prancing, skipping, and sashaying. Translating queer activism's moral injunction to come out into a literal exposure of the body's desirable flesh, these black queer men invert the moral injunction of civil rights, which declares that value can be found only in the inner content of one's character, that the color of one's skin is best veiled in dour middle-class clothes, gender appropriate of normative respectability. Finally, when we look more closely, we also realize that Riggs does not homologize from black ancestors to queer rights in general. He homologizes from black ancestors to black queer rights. The autobiographical narrative of the film seeks to rescue black gay brothers from the spell of whiteness, even if it does so anti-autobiographically against the grain of Riggs' actual everyday romance. This is why the camera focused intently on the black gay contingent of the parade, editing out any hint of white queer presence, converting the multicultural, multisexual, multigendered spectacle of a New York gay pride parade into a black gay male civil rights march. The closure says visually what it rehearses as political slogan. Black men loving black men is the revolutionary act. Grand Diva Snap. This contradicts Jefferson's bloodlusting analogic, whereby sexual desire naturally flows upward across race and species toward the other gender. For Riggs, sexual desire must flow within gender laterally from brother to brother, pulsing within that immovable veil of blackness. Mr. Jefferson might well ask, what hope of racist bloodline can that fix? What kind of racial lifeblood bleeds that way? Thank you.
All right. I might need this mic turned up. I don't know if that is turned up yet. Great. Let me try. Can you hear me back there? It doesn't sound yet.